I'd like to officially welcome you to the Edison and Ford Winter Estates. I'd like to formally introduce myself. My name is Matt Andres. I'm the Curatorial Registrar here. Thank you for joining us for this special presentation here today. We have Dr. Robert Apple, who has his PhD in musicology. He's a music historian and just a wealth of knowledge of anything related to music. He's our curatorial intern this semester, University of Memphis, and he has been wonderful and very, very knowledgeable. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Robert Apple.
So, before I get started with the presentation itself, I have a few thank yous. I finished my PhD in music history, but right now I'm working on a graduate certificate in museum studies. And as part of the fulfillment of that degree, I am required to complete 2 internships at 2 different museums. The second one I'm completing here right now. I've had the honor of working with the staff here, Matt, Chad, and Brent, the head curator. It's been fantastic. But over the summer, my previous internship was completed at IMAG Science and History Museum over on Cranford Avenue. If you haven't been there, I strongly suggest that you do. They have fantastic exhibits, and they also have really great programs for kids and students. And while I was interning there, I discovered in their object collection that they have these 3 wonderful instruments that were kind of the inspiration for the research that I started doing with them. What I completed for them over there was a digital exhibit that will be made available on their website in the next few months. That is on the history of Fort Myers bands from its beginning in 1885 to kind of the end of its golden age in 1937. Today, I'm just going to be talking about the history of the first band because the history I wrote to go along with that exhibit is about 114 pages, and I only have about a half hour to talk to you today. So we're going to stick with just what is the first chapter, and I also need to give a special thank you to the Southwest Florida Historical Society. A lot of the research and a lot of the photos you will be seeing today, I did at their little house, little yellow house.
Tell them where we are.
They have a lot of great material there, and
Tell them where we are, so you guys can come visit
you
us.
need to remind me of the address.
Grounds of the Alliance.
It's right next to the Alliance Arts.
It's on the
Yeah,
campus
sorry.
of the Alliance of the Arts on the northern end, right under the shadow of the
Yep.
overpass. Please come see us.
Exactly.
By the end, please come see us.
Your own house.
We'd love to see you. We're open 2 days a week, Wednesday and Saturday 9 to noon. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. I should have had that address committed to memory, considering how much time I spent there. So them and their members were great. Without further ado, we'll get started. So, the period of about 100 years from 1830 to about 1930 is often referred to by music historians, including me, as the golden age of American bands, due to the prominent role that brass and wind bands played in Americans' everyday lives. Yes,
Talk a little louder.
I can. I wish I had a mic, but I can talk louder. So, I was talking about the golden age of American bands. Took place from about 1830 to 1930, and it is so called because brass bands and wind bands played a very large role in the lives of everyday Americans. This was before the rise of the phonograph and the radio and the TV, so really the only good way you could get regular musical entertainment for people in the public was via bands. You had to perform it. During the early part of the 20th century and the latter part of the 19th century, we really didn't have very many symphony orchestras in the United States. Really only had them in big cities like Chicago and New York. So if you were, say, in the middle of Idaho, small farming community, the only way you really had an opportunity to hear live music performed was through your town band. Now, so this golden age was initiated by 2 important things, beginning in the 1930s. That was the invention of key and valve brass instruments. So before these newfangled instruments, a couple examples you can see here, Essentially, the instruments that Europeans and Americans were playing were so-called natural brass instruments. So-called because they didn't have a mechanism to make them a complete instrument, and they could only play notes what are referred to as the harmonic series. So if you remember your physics, notes that can be produced on just an open pipe. So that's essentially as many notes as you could play on those really early instruments. And that was a bit of a bugle call. Taps, probably know it. If you hear bugle music today, it's being played on an instrument similar to this. So, get to the 19th century. Most of the bands, really early 19th century, this is around 800, they were a good mix of woodwind instruments and brass instruments. But brass instruments really weren't doing the heavy lifting as far as playing the main melody. That was given to woodwind instruments because they could play chromatic notes. So, two new mechanisms invented at the very beginning of the 19th century to fix this problem. The first was keys. And this is an example of one of those keyed instruments. This is called a keyed bugle. If you are familiar with jazz music, the flugelhorn, this is the granddaddy of that instrument. This is the exact same instrument, just that instrument has valves like on a modern trumpet, like this instrument here, a cornet. And these instruments have very unique sounds. So I'm going to play just a bit, beginning with a solo piece for keyed bugle. So, as you could hear, a fully functional, fully melodic instrument, and this kind of became the melody-carrying brass instrument of bands. Problem with this system, it's very complicated. This instrument has 8 keys. The teeny tiny version of it, the one that's pitched even higher, in E flat has upwards of 12. So these were really only played by professional musicians, but the second system that was invented is one we are more familiar with today. It's the valve system. So, very easy physics. This system takes a pipe, you open a key, it makes the pipe shorter, raises the pitch of the instrument. That way you can get more notes. This does the exact opposite. You play a note. Open them in succession, you lengthen the pipe, you lower the pitch of the instrument, you get more notes. Now this is a much simpler system. It has 3 buttons, easier for professionals and amateurs to learn. So when this became an invention, that's really when the American brass band craze took off, because it meant people who were amateurs, not trained professionals, could play these brass instruments. And they were also, well, you can do a lot of chromatic fast things that are very showy very easily, whereas if I were trying to do that on this instrument, it would be quite a bit more difficult.
About what date would you say?
Oh yes, so I was going to get to that, but since we had a question, this is an original keyed bugle made around 1830. It was restored for me by a friend of mine named Rob Stewart. You're going to see a few pictures of instruments restored by him. And this, a point I'm going to get to in a moment, the second big contributing factor. So we have new brass instruments that can play chromatically, but also importantly, they are now being made cheaply, specifically in Germany. There's a region of Germany called the Vogtland that is was a center in the early 19th century of music instrument manufacturing, and they used a really early form of factory production. Not on an assembly line a la Ford, but in terms of division of labor. So what they would do is one family would specialize in making bells, another family would make the keys, another family would make mouthpieces, and another family would make lead pipes, and then the other family would get all the parts and put them together. This has allowed you to make many more instruments very quickly and make them very cheaply. So around 1830, 1840, 1850, most Americans who were playing on keyed brasses and even some really early valved instruments like that one, I'll talk about in a bit, were playing mostly on German imports. Now, there were American makers of brass instruments, but like these examples here, they tended to be the more expensive models. They were kind of the Rolls Royce. They cost a lot more money, they were much higher quality. These were being played by your professional band leaders. So this is a very good example of your typical key bugle from the 1830s. So yeah. All right.
Dr. Apple, you're calling the silver one brass, but does brass come in silver color?
Okay, well, all right, so I'll make you know. One last question. I'll answer questions at the end, but just to answer very quickly. So this is still a brass instrument. It is brass underneath. It's silver plated.
Oh, okay.
This is the case with most modern brass instruments. There are a few exceptions, including that one over there that I will get to in a moment. But moving on. No problem. So that's a little bit about the development of brass. Talked about American makers, talked about other things, and we also talked about the advantages. Now, one of the other really big advantages of the new brass instruments that were being made is they were being made in families. Really teeny tiny instruments like the key bugle and the cornet, these were your soprano melody instruments, and then you had bigger instruments like our alto horn down there that would play the middle section of the band, and then you had really big instruments like tubas. And this allows you to make an entire ensemble just out of brass instruments. This is also a really good economic benefit in that you can have a band of about 10 to 16 players, which is what a 19th century band essentially consisted of. And that would supply enough music for everybody in a big crowd to hear. Whereas, a symphony orchestra, you need 20, 30 strings or something like that. It's much more expensive. So this was more economical, you needed fewer people, and you could play nice and loud. So, moving on to the Civil War. So, American brass bands continued to develop through the Civil War years. By then, keyed brass instruments like the keyed bugle had essentially fallen out of use, and by then, Americans were mainly using valved brass instruments. Now, by the 1850s, there were about 3,000 bands formed in America, and after that, it just kept growing. Every Civil War regiment would found their own band, and then after the Civil War, all of the surviving members of the band would go home and found their own band. So just a massive growth of these bands. And by the 1870s, brass bands in America really were ubiquitous. They were a very important part of American culture. If you were a town or a city and you did not have a band, you were considered uncultured. So this was about a bit of a status symbol, and this is very much the case with some of the pioneers that were moving to Fort Myers in the 1880s. So a bit about Fort Myers running up to the 1880s. At that point in time, Fort Myers really wasn't a town yet. It was more of a settlement. It was known as a cow herding town. Right on the shores of the Caloosahatchee River, situated near the Gulf Coast and the city of Ponta Rosa. Most of the industry in Fort Myers at the time was cow herding, and it was big business because 1868, the Cubans and the Spaniards start fighting a war. The Cubans wanted cattle to feed their army, so Floridian cattle ranchers would ship their cattle down to Cuba. They'd make good money. Unfortunately, by 1878, the Spanish had won, and they cut off imports of cattle from Florida completely, and the Florida cattle market just crashed. So 1878, people in Fort Myers were not doing really well. However, it did not take very long for fortunes to turn. So on May 30th, 1881, a very wealthy entrepreneur named Hamilton Diston purchased 4 million acres of Florida land in Southwest Florida. Most of it was swampland, and part of the contract of him getting that money, getting that land, was he was going to drain it and turn it into farmland, specifically to farm sugarcane, because at the time, sugarcane was commanding a very high price. He was hoping to cash in big. And during the 1880s, this attracted many, many settlers to Southwest Florida, including 3 important people we'll talk about today: Peter Oliphant Knight, the brothers Joseph C. and William Preston Henley, and Edward Lewis Evans. Now, Diston's Florida land reclamation project was an abysmal failure. He, at most, created 80,000 acres of new farmland. But by 1887, when it started to fall apart, enough people had shown up in Fort Myers that they just decided to stay, and that included those 3 children. In fact, by 1885, Fort Myers had experienced a giant population boom. By then, there were now 349 citizens in the city. They had 50 houses, 3 general stores, 3 lodging houses or inns, and it was really booming. And with that in mind, I'm getting ahead of myself, sorry. August 12th, 1885, Fort Myers was incorporated as a legal town. It didn't take very long after the official corporations of Fort Myers for a group of young men to decide that now that we're an official town, we need a band. So they got together November 21st, 1885 at the home of S.E. Titus, Mrs. S.E. Titus on Jackson Street, to discuss the proposition of forming a band. Very quickly, they all decided it was a great idea, and they started electing officers, because bands in America at this time were set up like a fraternity or a social club. So they elected their first president, J. L. Cutter, their vice president, P.C. Gaines, their secretary, W.M. Jameson, and Edward Lewis Evans as their treasurer. Now, of these 4 men, Evans is a particular note, because when Thomas Edison visited Fort Myers in March of 1885, he was the gentleman who showed him around town, took him to see some of the bamboo groves, some of the farmland. Thomas Edison really fell in love with the area, and Evans introduced him to essentially the real estate broker who sold him the land that he eventually built his winter estate on. Evans is also very important if you're a fan of sports fishing. He was the gentleman that really got the tarpon fishing craze in Fort Myers rolling. Had many celebrities who would visit him, and he actually designed bait and tackle. That was very popular at the time. Now, also at that meeting, it was decided that the 20-year-old lawyer, Peter Oliphant Knight, pictured here holding a clarinet, would become the band's director. He was very well suited for the role because he was a very talented leader. He would go on to be the 2nd mayor of Fort Myers, and later he would move to Tampa, where he'd be very involved in politics there. And he was also a very talented musician. He played many instruments. He played the cornet, that instrument right there, clarinet, banjo, piano, so on and so forth. And by the way, this is the earliest picture of the Fort Myers brass band. All right. So after they elected officers, chose the director, they all decided to start meeting on a weekly basis to start rehearsing every Saturday. As agreed, November 28th, 1885, they got back together, they voted on their bylaws, and they decided to welcome 2 new members into the ranks. By the end of that meeting, they had 17 members, the perfect number for a good brass band. 2 months later, their instruments had arrived, they started rehearsing. However, Mrs. Titus's neighbors quickly started launching complaints about all the racket in the evening, and the band was politely asked to move their rehearsals down to the wharf, where the news press reports the sound of steam ship horns drowned out their rehearsals. So, a few weeks later, according to Carl H. Grismer's book, The Story of Fort Myers, which at the moment is the most extensive history of the area. Give it a read. The band gave their first public concert on March 25th, 1886. It was a serenade. They went marching down what is now McGregor Avenue, and they stopped in front of the almost completed Edison Winter Estate to welcome Thomas and Mina Edison to the area. They had just gotten married. This was their welcoming party. Mina is quoted by Grismer as saying she had never before heard such ethereal music, in reference to the band's music. However, this might have been her being polite, because need to remember, the Fort Myers Brass Band were amateur players, they were not professionals, and they all had day jobs. So for instance, William Preston Henley was a contractor. In fact, he was one of the contractors that helped build the Edison Estates. Peter O'Knight, of course, was a mayor and a lawyer, and Evans owned a general store, which also handled a lot of sport and hunt fishing equipment. All right, so a number of the members of the Fort Myers Brass Band continued to be lifelong friends with Edison, and this included both Knight and Evans, as evidenced by this letter that is in the IMAG's collection. It's dated March 11th, 1930. It is from Evans to Knight, and I know it's a bit tiny to read, but I will give you the cliff notes. Evans is basically telling Knight about a visit that Thomas Edison made to his general store, during which they kind of reminisced about the good old days when they both first moved to Fort Myers. And this letter specifically talks about the serenade that the band played for them in 1886. There's this little anecdote about how Edison was talking, Knight, the band's cornet player, was triple tonguing and playing into Edison's one good ear so he could actually hear him playing. And in fact, the Evans family, when Thomas passed away, Miss Edison actually sent a telegraph to Mrs. Evans. They also have that at the IMAG collection as well. All right. So, for the next 3 years, the band thrived under Knight's leadership, performing free concerts every Saturday night at the bandstand constructed for them in front of Knight's house at the intersection of 2nd and Lee Streets. Unfortunately, this got torn down, I think, in 1917, so it no longer exists, but this was a community center for Fort Myers for a very long time. They would play for various and sundry town events. These included holiday celebrations like Christmas concerts, weddings, funerals, political rallies, mostly Democratic Party, steamboat trips, and also balls. Unfortunately, the Fort Myers News Press very rarely actually reported the exact music that they played, but they probably played a very similar repertoire to other brass bands in America at the time. This included a good mix of marches, arrangements of popular tunes, and dance music such as this waltz from the period. This is being performed by the Coates Brass Band for a historical brass band meeting. They play on all antique brass instruments from the period, and they perform music from that period. So this might be a good example of what the brass band may have sounded like. Pleasant music, kind of music. This is light music. This is pop music. This is not your big symphonies or your serious classical music. This is something that's pleasant to listen to on an evening after you're done with work. You want to go out with your wife or the lady you're courting and have a dance and have a good time. So one of the fantastic things about working at IMAG, and I kind of touched on this earlier, but let's talk about them now. IMAG collection, they have these 3 musical instruments here. These are all instruments that belonged to the Fort Myers Brass Band's tuba player, William Preston Henley. They were donated to the IMAG Museum. Before it was called the IMAG, it was called the Fort Myers Historical Museum. I think back during the 60s. We have 3 instruments here. So this right here is an alto sax horn. If you ever listen to British brass band music, this is kind of the early granddad of the alto horn. It's pitched in E flat, and it looks like it's made of silver. And that is by design, but it's not. This is actually what's called German silver or nickel silver. It's brass.
May I have your attention, please? The 2:30 guided tour is now meeting on the museum porch. If you signed up for the 2:30 guided tour, please meet on the museum porch at this time. Thank you.
Well, please don't run away. Anyways, so brass is an alloy of copper and zinc. To make it silver colored like this, they added nickel to it, hence the term nickel silver. This instrument, before I got the IMAG, was in a pretty pitiful state. It was this color. In fact, I thought it was made of brass because it was so badly corroded and yellowed. But no, it's made of that special alloy. Nickel silver instruments were essentially kind of your high-end instrument. They were a bit more expensive. So this was probably bought by William Preston Henley's J.C. Henley. He was actually the band's alto horn player, so he most likely played this instrument in the band back in the 1880s. Now, this is another example of a German import. My friend Rob Stewart, who's very well researched in that, took a look at this instrument and said, yes, that's a German instrument. So this was probably bought cheaply. It doesn't have a maker's mark, neither does this instrument, because the intent here was you would import it from Germany and then you would stamp your own label on it for your store. These are blank, so you're not going to be able to read this, but somebody wrote on the inside of the bell, bought in 1870. This is the kind of stuff that historians love because it saves us work. So this instrument from 1870, it's a little different than the instruments we're used to today, because rather than piston valves like on my cornet over there, these have rotary valves like on a French horn. Unfortunately not workable, parts of the mechanism are missing, and there are also cracks in it, so it's not playable, but it certainly looks a lot better because one of my other friends, John Patton, he lives in the area. He specializes in restoring antique cornets. He offered to do some restoration work, and it really needed it because not only was it corroded on the outside, but this is what the inside of the valves looked like. So he had to take it. Those are the dirtiest valves he's ever seen. So yeah, a very nice instrument, and emblematic of what was being played there. Now, it might seem strange for a brass player like Henley to own a flute, but I assure you it is not, and I'm getting ahead of myself, because while that alto horn is not playable, I do have another friend and colleague named Annika Scott who plays historical horns professionally. I'm going to play a recording of her playing an instrument very similar to that one. I wish I could play the whole thing, but we have other things to talk about too. So my main point with playing your recordings of historical instruments is, even though we often think that as modern people that modern technology is always better, you always get instantly better results. My point here is just because these instruments may have still been developing, the technology wasn't perfect, doesn't mean that you couldn't make really good music with them, especially when they're in the hands of a really good player like I. So one of the other instruments that Henley owned was this flute. And it is quite delicate. Also not playable. You can see it has cracks in several places. This is made of ivory and kokos wood, double checking, and it only has 8 keys. So if you're familiar with a modern flute, those are typically made of metal. They have many, many, many keys. This is kind of a very good example of the kind of flute that Americans were playing during the 1880s. And here's the thing. Yes, American brass bands were principally composed of brass instruments, but occasionally they would bring in a woodwind instrument for a little bit of novelty. So there was that earlier photograph of Knight, the band leader, holding clarinet. They probably also occasionally broke out the flute to kind of make things sound a little more interesting than just brass all the time. And I also have another friend. I'm going to play you a recording of this flute. Okay, so this flute, if I am remembering correctly, built by an American company. So this is an American flute. It was built by the Firth Pond and Company sometime between 1857 and 1862. This is all information I'm getting from Michael Lynn, because he is a historic flute expert and performer. Built in a place near Litchfield, Connecticut called Fluteville. This particular company actually built an entire town around their flute factory. So they had schools, they had houses, it was a company town, so called because they made flutes. Now, do not have a recording of this particular flute because it is just broken, but this is a very similar flute built by someone who was a former partner of Flute. And if you look very carefully, it is dangerously close to being a copy of that flute. So without further ado, this is Michael Lynn. He's the historic flute professor at the Oberlin Conservatory. Let me get to the part. Here we go. Sorry, Michael, gonna have to interrupt you. So, a bit of a more softer sound, a little bit less piercing than a modern metal flute. So the third instrument we have here is, well, it's a guitar. It's an acoustic guitar. Several of the members of the brass band, including Knight, William Henley, and W.R. Washburn, were also members of the Fort Myers String Band. And this group typically included guitar, mandolin, banjo, so on and so forth. Basically, this is the ensemble you would use if you needed music inside for a small room. You don't really want a full-size brass band in your living room for an evening. You want something quieter. So this particular instrument belonged to William Preston Henley, most likely used during their performances. This was made by the Haynes and Company. It's part of their Bay State line, so-called because they were made in Boston, Massachusetts. Like a typical acoustic guitar, it has 6 strings, although this would have originally had gut strings rather than metal strings. Obviously it doesn't have those anymore. And it's also a bit tinier, a little bit skinnier. This is what modern guitars would refer to as a parlor guitar, although they really didn't call them that back in the day. But the intent was you have a smaller guitar, it's a little bit cheaper, but it's also a little bit quieter, so you can play it inside for your friends in your parlor. Spruce for the front and then rosewood on the back. Very pleasant instrument, unfortunately not playable at the moment. And to give you an idea of what this instrument might have sounded when it was in the prime of its life, one more clip. Maybe, possibly. Second about it. There we go. really pleasant little instruments. All right, so returning to our story of the Fort Myers Brass Band, if you want to cooperate with me. Maybe. Aha! All right, so in October of 1889, two very unfortunate events occurred in quick succession that would eventually result in the first of several periods of inactivity for the Fort Myers Brass Band. The first of these is that Knight, the band's director, left. He moved to Tampa on October 22nd to start up a law firm with Joseph B. Wall. And the second was the destruction on October 27th via fire of the Simons and Evans Hall. This was a dance hall that was on the second floor of Evans General Store. This dance hall was one of the venues that the brass band played at regularly for dances and concerts, so it got wiped out. And unfortunately, the combination of these two events kind of spelled the doom for a while. So the band was very quickly reorganized on October 26, 1889 under the leadership of Professor H. Higginbottom. And Evans did rebuild his general store, which is what this photo is of, in 1890. And on the second floor, he also rebuilt the Simons and Evans Hall, nicknamed Phoenix Hall for unironic reasons. However, this really didn't help things. So by February of 1891, the band had kind of gone into a hiatus. The band would remain inactive until December 1st, 1896, when it was reorganized yet again under the directorship of Professor M.B. Gottwell, who also served as the band's new solo cornetist. Several of the band's original members returned, the Henley brothers, Joseph and William P., and several others. And several new members joined the old guard, including L.A. Farmington, who became the band's second cornetist and second alto player, C. Minge as the second alto horn player, E.M. Reynolds as its first tenor horn, W.A. Marsh as the group's baritone horn player, T.H. Levens on snare, and T. Henderson on bass drum and cymbals. Now, according to the December 19th, 1895 edition of the Fort Myers News Press, the band began to immediately rehearse to get back into shape. And just a few short weeks later, it gave its first performance after its reformation at a horse race on Christmas Day, 1896. From 1896 to 1902, the band got back to work doing what it had done originally, giving free concerts every Saturday evening at their bandstand at Lee and Second, and providing music for Fort Myers community events, with the Phoenix Hall becoming one of its biggest venues. One of the highlights of the band's second period of activity was its participation in the Fort Myers 4th of July celebration of 1896. According to the news press, they were dressed in new uniforms, which no one bothered to photograph them in. And they started off the day's event leading a parade. Later that day, they, according to the papers, performed 80 pieces for the crowds of about 1,500 people who were there snacking down on Independence Day barbecue. That evening, they played a concert on the wharves to accompany a fireworks display, and then that night, they all retired to the Phoenix Hall to perform as part of a band that raged until the late hour of midnight. Though it's not clear why, after participating in the 4th of July celebration of 1902, the band went into another hiatus, with it disappearing from the papers until 1904. Now, fortunately, the band would be reorganized one final time under the leadership of Professor Francis Wright Harriet. He's best known today as one of the politicians who campaigned for the construction of the Tamiami Trail. But at the time when he moved to Fort Myers, he had recently graduated from the New England Conservatory of Music. He was a singer, he played many instruments including keyboard and cornet, so he was a really good candidate for band leader. That same year, Perry also formed Fort Myers Orchestra. It's not a symphony orchestra, this was essentially the replacement for the string band. So that particular band featured Perry on cornet, Fred Cutter on violin, Walter Cutter on piano, A. E. Gilbert on cello, and Gus Ficciato on mandolin. So kind of a combination of a bluegrass band plus a couple of brass instruments. And that band also played a lot of the time at the Phoenix Hall, mostly dance music. Now, that band, along with the brass band, sometimes shared a dual gig, such as the one they played on December 12, 1904, to celebrate the reopening of the newly renovated Royal Palm Hotel. Now, the Royal Palm Hotel, if you're familiar with the history of the area, was one of the most important resorts in town. Originally built and opened as the Fort Myers Hotel in 1898, but was bought, expanded, and the band supplied the music for that reopening. Now, unfortunately, the brass band's second and final revival was very short-lived, and the last time the paper mentions them is in a story that reports that they performed as part of the June 12, 1906 Lee County High School commencement exercises, during which they performed the Red, White, and Blue. This is one of the very few times that the Fort Myers Press actually told me what they played. And coincidence of coincidences, there's also a really nice arrangement by John F. Stranson of this tune for small brass band, same size as the Fort Myers Orchestra. So play a little bit of that, because it probably sounds very similar to what the Fort Myers Brass Band sounded like back in the day. Now, it's not completely clear why exactly the Fort Myers Brass Band eventually went defunct. It would be really nice if newspapers and people would actually just tell you why things happen, but that's not always the case for historians, so sometimes we have to do some educated guessing. So this is me doing some educated guessing. So one contributing factor may have been the fact that on October 3rd, 1906, Perry, the new director of the band, got married. So there is a possibility that now that he was a married man, he needed to settle down and start raising a family. He perhaps felt that he did not have the free time to lead the band anymore, so he had to step aside. There was also the other contributing factor, which is brass bands were kind of on the way out. And this was courtesy of a man you've probably heard of, John Philip Sousa. He was a Marine Corps band that got its start in the 1880 to about 1892, and then later his civilian touring band became insanely popular. Everybody in the United States knew who John Philip Sousa's band was, and his band was quite a bit different than the Fort Myers Brass Band. For one, it used both woodwinds and brass instruments, large sections of them. It's huge. This is a picture of the Marine Corps band from 1891. So this is not a small 10 to 17 person band. This was every instrument, every person you can get. And this kind of became the new craze. So that might have been another contributing factor, that brass bands were on the way out, big mixed concert bands were on the way in. Now, evidence that both of these possibilities were most likely the case can be found in a very brief news story published in the August 30th, 1906 edition of the Fort Myers News Press, which reported that the Fort Myers Military Band was reorganized on August 28th, 1906, under the leadership of P.L. McAdow. Now, the report also states that our town, Fort Myers, certainly needs such a musical organization, and the new band should receive every encouragement. Now, the fact that the Fort Myers had never had a military band like this kind of tells us that we're trying to found a new band, but the fact that they refer to it as being reorganized probably meant that some of the older members of the brass band were going to become a part of this newer band. Unfortunately, this new military band really didn't survive. It didn't really take off, and it wasn't until 1911 that Fort Myers founded its first new military band after Sousa. But that is a story for another day. If you would like to learn more about the later history of Fort Myers bands, please keep your eyes open for when the IMAG's digital exhibit opens up, because that exhibit covers that period. But for now, that's all I got for you today. I'd like to thank you all very much for attending the presentation.